What did Copernicus mean by the thrice greatest?
Copernicus' phrase "the thrice greatest" was a reference to Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek name of the Egyptian god Thoth, who was credited with healing arts and secret knowledge by Neoplatonists.
How did Spinoza consider good and evil?
Spinoza sought to consider human actions and desires objectively, almost like mathematical questions. Virtuous actions result from understanding and are either self-preserving or altruistic. But the two are united. Nothing is more useful to man than man. He defined good as what we certainly know to be useful to us, and evil as what we certainly know prevents us from being masters of some good. Because God is perfect, he has no needs, from which it follows that nothing is good or evil to him. God's blessing is not a reward for virtuous behavior, but an inevitable result of living according to reason or having adequate knowledge. Spinoza also held that citizens of a state cannot give up their right to attain their own well-being.
What did Simone de Beauvoir mean by an ethics of ambiguity?
Beauvoir expressed a disappointment with politics after World War II, and she addressed the importance of mass action and relations between political party leaders and their followers and colleagues. She applied Jean-Paul Sartre's, 1905–1980, existential philosophy to politics, criticizing the spirit of seriousness that characterized those who did not take responsibility for their political actions as free individuals. Although Sartre had never written on ethics, she thought that ethical positions and decisions would arise from compelling passions and circumstances. The best interpretation of Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, 1947, is not that ethics is itself ambiguous, but that ethics is somewhat arbitrary from an existentialist perspective.
Who was Edith Stein?
Edith Stein, 1891–1942, was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1998 as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. She was born into an observant Jewish family in the Central European region of Silesia, which was then part of the German Empire. In 1932 she denounced the Nazi regime to Pope Pius XI. She converted to Roman Catholicism in 1922 and was received into the Discalced Carmelite order in 1934 in a retaliatory move against Jewish converts in the Netherlands, where the Carmelites had sent Stein for safety. She and her sister Rosa were transported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. They died there in the gas chamber in 1942. Stein was a student of Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938. First at Göttingen University and then at Freiburg, where she became his assistant. Her doctorate was on the problem of empathy. She became a faculty member at Freiburg University after working with Martin Heidegger in preparing Husserl's manuscripts for publication. As a Jewish woman, she was barred from further postgraduate studies at Freiburg and other German universities. She finally gave up her assistantship to Husserl and began to teach in Catholic girls' schools. Learning about Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225 to 1274, and Catholic philosophy in general. She did become a lecturer at the Institute for Pedagogy at Munster, but had to give it up due to anti-Semitic laws in 1933, the same year that her former colleague Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, was made rector of Freiburg University. The miracle Edith Stein is supposed to have performed that of curing a child who had overdosed on acetaminophen in response to a prayer from relatives is disputed by some Jewish groups who claim it is not clear whether she is a genuine martyr. Her legacy includes numerous writings, some of which were translated into English in the 1980s and 1990s. Life in a Jewish Family, her unfinished autobiographical account, 1986. On the Problem of Empathy, 1989, Essays on Women, 1996, and The Hidden Life, 1993. Stein also wrote Knowledge and Faith, Finite and Eternal Being. An attempt to an ascent to the meaning of being, Philosophy of Psychology and the Humanities. Self-Portrait in Letters, which have not yet been translated into English or published.
What is eliminative materialism?
Eliminative materialism is the doctrine, first proposed by Paul Feyerabend, 1974 to 1994, in the early 1960s, that science will eventually make it possible to eliminate all customary talk that presupposes non-material minds in favor of references to brain states only. The Canadian-born American philosopher Paul Chitchland, 1942, and his wife Patricia Chitchland, 1943, have developed this view into a distinct branch of philosophy of mind. The Chitchlands have held that our ordinary common sense theory of mind consisting of intentions, desires, and motives is mere folk psychology, which, like other folk beliefs, ought to be put aside in intellectual and scientific endeavors. Chitchland wrote, "Eliminative materialism is the thesis that our common sense conception of psychological phenomena constitutes a radically false theory. A theory so fundamentally defective that both the principles and the ontology of that theory will eventually be displaced, rather than smoothly reduced, by completed neuroscience." Principal publications by Paul Chitchland include Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind, 1979. Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes, published in the Journal of Philosophy in 1981. And the Engine of Reason, The Seat of the Soul, 1996, both Paul and Patricia penned on the contrary, 1998.
How is sociology related to philosophy?
Social and political philosophers discuss society and criticize culture. Sociology is the science that can give them factual information about what they are discussing.
Why did George Berkeley like tar water so much?
Some biographers claim that George Berkeley suffered the constant discomforts of constipation over his entire life, until finally, in late middle age, he found lasting relief in tar water, which is an extract of tree bark. The following appears in A Century of Anecdotes from 1760 to 1860, by John Timms. Bishop Berkeley, having received benefit from the use of tar water, when ill of the colic, published a work on the virtues of tar water, and a few months before his death, a sequel, entitled Further Thoughts on Tar Water, and when accused of fancying he had discovered a nostrum in tar water, he replied, that, to speak out, he freely owns he suspects tar water is a panacea.
What are the main themes and influences in philosophy of technology?
Most of the writing is on the progressive/environmentalist/feminist/postmodern side of contemporary philosophy. While not anti-technology per se, there is a deep suspicion of technology as a force in its own right that stems from Martin Heidegger's, 1889 to 1976, The Question Concerning Technology. By contrast, more optimistic views of technology stem from the writings of John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Key issues are, whether technology can be controlled independently of radical economic and political changes, whether technology can correct its own excesses, and the roles played by technology in the history of science. Contemporary books of interest include, Michael Adass, Machines as the Measure of Men. Science, Technology, and Ideologies of Western Dominance, 1990, Eric Higgs Anthology Technology and the Good Life. 2000, and Hans Achterhues, American Philosophy of Technology, 2001.
What was Rosicrucianism?
Rosicrucianism was the practice of the secret Christian Rosicrucian order, which was dedicated to helping mankind develop spiritually. The practices of the Rosicrucians were not published or otherwise known to the general public, but they were believed to involve ancient Neoplatonic knowledge, alchemy, and ways to cure the sick. Some believe it began after Dante degli Alighieri, c. 1265 to 1321, wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 1300s. Others locate its beginnings within a group of German Protestants in the early 1600s. Three documents circulated throughout Europe in the 15th century to promote what the Rosicrucians called the universal reformation of mankind, Fama Fraternitatis Rosicrucis. Confessio Fraternitatis, and Chimical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz anno 1459.
What happens after absolute knowledge is attained?
Friedrich Hegel's science is aimed at uniting Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 system of transcendental categories to Aristotle's 384–322b. CE, Logic about the real world. Hegel divides his thought process into treatments of being, essence, and concept, which are each divided into three parts, and so on. The contradictions in each category of nature require resolution leading to the categories that succeed it. According to Hegel, nature itself has developed in a logical way, leading to ever greater abstractions in the form of our knowledge of nature. Hegel did not make clear distinctions between things in themselves in an ordinary, realist sense, and our knowledge of those things. For Hegel, then, the progression toward more complexity in nature corresponds with a progression in human knowledge.
Why was Averroes considered important by other philosophers?
Averroes, known as Ibn Rushd in the Islamic world, c. 1126 c. 1198, was born in Córdoba, Spain. He brought the tradition of comparative philosophy begun by Avicenna and rendered problematic by Al-Ghazali to a new level of intellectual sophistication. His main project was to settle the debate among his contemporaries about whether Aristotle's philosophy was compatible with Islam. As Avicenna had claimed, or opposed to it as Al-Ghazali, 1058–1111, had objected.
What are primary qualities and secondary qualities?
The scientific distinction between primary and secondary qualities was to prove very important for subsequent philosophy. Primary qualities are size, shape, mass, motion, and quantity. Secondary qualities were color, texture, sound, and smell. It was believed that the primary qualities of atoms resulted in the secondary qualities that could be sensed by us in objects made up of atoms. That is, the world of our perception is made up of secondary qualities, which are formed by interactions between the atoms in objects and the atoms in our sense organs. Secondary qualities are exactly those qualities of sense such as color, sound, texture, and smell that make up our everyday experience. But the real world was made up of atoms.
What was Alasdair MacIntyre's contribution to virtue ethics?
Alasdair MacIntyre, 1929, has approached ethics with a rejection of both Marxism and late 20th century consumer capitalism. In his return to Thomistic Aristotelianism, or Aristotelianism influenced by the altruistic and religious values of Christianity, he considers the nature of moral argument about competing systems and has reclaimed Edith Stein, 1891–1942, as a phenomenologist. MacIntyre views virtues as moral qualities needed to fulfill human potential. He has focused on the combination of practice, virtue, and tradition. Practice is communal action. Virtue is the individual dispositions and habits that are necessary to participate in practice. Tradition is the history of a community as an object of reflection. MacIntyre thus thinks that virtues develop and are practiced in communities, and that moral communities must be understood in terms of their history. MacIntyre's view is not intended to be conservative in a social or political sense, but is instead developed as an understanding of Aristotelian virtues that would not have been possible without the fact of all the history that has ensued since Aristotle wrote.
What is applied ethics?
Applied ethics is the study of existing ethical principles in practical fields of human endeavor, such as medicine, engineering, business, law, and environmentalism. Applied ethics also extends to new moral rules for new situations, such as the rights of airline passengers and disaster victims, moral issues involved in human cloning, and consumer protection. In this sense, applied ethics is practical ethics. It is a study of ethics of practice. In addition, applied ethics can be more critical as it applies theoretical moral systems and moral theories to practices and fields outside of philosophy. Existing rules and behavior in a given field may be theoretically justified or criticized by philosophical ethicists. In some cases, new moral directions may emerge. Environmental ethics is a good example of the theoretical dimension of applied ethics.
What is moral conventionalism?
Ethical or moral conventionalism is the view that what makes something good or an action right is a general cultural belief. Ethical conventionalism has descriptive and prescriptive forms. Prescriptive conventionalism says that we ought to follow conventions. Descriptive conventionalism says that we do follow conventions.
What was William James' main contribution to psychology?
James developed the same theory that was independently developed by Carl George Lang, 1834–1900. the Danish physician and psychologist. It became known as the James Lange theory of the emotions. The theory is that emotions are our experience of changes in our bodies. Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, had held that emotions are the effects of our beliefs, while René Descartes, 1596–1650, in Passions of the Soul, 1649, had expressed an earlier version of the James Lange theory. Our common sense assumption is that emotions are reactions to events in the world that are mediated by our understanding. By contrast, the James Lange theory held that our bodies react directly to the world, and our awareness of this physical reaction constitutes our emotions.
How has Jacques Derrida's post-structuralism been received?
Derrida's contemporary Michel Foucault, 1926–1984, who many have regarded as a structuralist, accused him of practicing a terrorism of obscurantism. Foucault meant that those who could not understand Derrida, that is, most of his philosophical contemporaries, were attacked by Derrida as idiots. American philosophers such as Noam Chomsky, 1929, John Searle, 1932, and Richard Rorty, 1931–2007, have mocked and dismissed Derrida. Searle referred to the deliberate obscurantism of the prose, the wildly exaggerated claims, and the constant striving to give the appearance of profundity by making claims that seem paradoxical, but under analysis often turn out to be silly or trivial. Chomsky thought that Derrida's work was typical of the local eccentric tradition of Parisian intellectuals, without it being an explicit issue for them. Chomsky and Searle assume that meaning itself is stable and their theoretical work proceeds on that basis. However, Rorty, who has claimed that it might be impossible to understand Derrida's metaphysics, has a view similar to Derrida's about the false pretensions to truth that philosophers entertain.
How did Robert Burton apply scientific methods to his own mind?
Robert Burton, 1577–1640, spent most of his life at Oxford University, where he was vicar of St. Thomas Church. He was later appointed rector of Segrave, Leicester. He was a mathematician with interests in astrology and was known to be companionable and cheerful. However, he suffered all his life from a heavy heart and hatchling in my head. A kind of imposthume in my head, which I was very desirous to be unladen of. In the preface to the Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, he explained the work as therapeutic. I write of melancholy, by being busy to avoid melancholy. There is no greater cause of melancholy than idleness, no better cure than business.
What is the Tao?
The Tao, or way, advocated by Confucius involves appropriately performing one's roles in the family and society according to Zhen, or loving respect for others. All are presumed to be equal in acting according to Zhen. And if all act in this manner, the whole of society and the world will be improved.
What was Gottlob Frege's landmark insight about meaning?
Frege's theory of language was set forth in 3 essays. Function and Concept, On Concept and Object, and Sense and Reference. He noted that some identity statements are true and informative. For example, the sentence Venus is Venus does not tell me anything, but the sentence the morning star is the evening star is informative, although it means the same as Venus is Venus. Because Venus is in fact both the morning star and the evening star.
Why was Adam Smith's work important?
Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790, defined the economic system of capitalism and at the same time founded the science of modern economics in his An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776. He sought to answer the question of how nations grow richer. Assuming that human life would improve as nations prospered. He analyzed the importance of the ongoing division of labor in the industrialization process, and argued for free competition based on the profit motive. This would be a system of economic liberty or laissez-faire, let them do it. He argued that selfishness in acquiring wealth would result in better conditions for all. Through the invisible hand of the marketplace.
What are some highlights of Jane Addams' life that led her to found Hull House?
Addams' father was a mill owner and politician in Cedarville, Illinois. Her mother died when she was 2, while giving birth to her 9th child. Addams attended Rockford Seminary, a women's college, failed in medical school, and became depressed for a decade, during which she traveled throughout Europe. Along the way she visited London's Toynbee Hall, which was a young men's community that helped poor Jewish and Irish immigrants in East London by working within these people's neighborhoods. Addams resolved to duplicate this plan. And in 1889 she founded Hull House in the near West Side community of Chicago. Hull House was run and operated by women. Addams had long-term relationships with her co-founder and college friend Ellen Gates Starr, and, later on, with her colleague Mary Rosette Smith. Addams' work at Hull House, and other settlement houses based on it, made her well known. She became a very popular public speaker. She was involved in the founding of other progressive organizations, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Former President Theodore Roosevelt asked her to second his nomination for the presidency by the Bull Moose Progressive Party in 1912. Roosevelt had served 3 years as U.S. President after 1901, and a full term after 1904. The Progressive Party strongly supported women's rights and suffrage. However, Adams became a target for intense public criticism when she expressed both pacifist and feminist views before World War I. Toward the end of her life, she dedicated herself to world peace and African American civil rights.
Was Aquinas able to solve the conflict between faith and reason?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, redefined faith as a kind of knowledge, rather than as a specific feeling or attitude of mind. As such, he said that faith fell between opinion and scientific knowledge. Faith was greater than opinion because it involved strong agreement, as an act of will. And it was less than scientific knowledge because it lacked factual evidence that could compel agreement. Aquinas thought that philosophy was reasoning based on existing knowledge or experience, leading to new knowledge, which he called the way of discovery. He held that philosophy was also the use of reason to confirm beliefs by tracing them back to basic principles, which he called the way of reduction. Philosophy becomes theology if the beliefs one begins with are based on faith. There are, in turn, two kinds of theology: truths in Scripture that are learned for their own sake, and metaphysics or explanations based on religious principles. Despite his theological idea of metaphysics, Aquinas did distinguish between philosophy and theology. For instance, in De Aeternitate Mundi, although he held the religious belief that the universe was not eternal, he said that it might be eternal based on philosophical reasoning. In general, apart from religious revelation, Aquinas believed that we get our knowledge from sense experience and our intellectual understanding of our sense experience. Did St.
Who was Louis Althusser?
Louis Althusser, 1918–1990, was a philosopher who was also a member of the French Communist Party. He is known for Marx, 1965, Reading Capital, 1968, and especially Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays, 1978. His main project was to derive from Karl Marx's 1818–1883 writings a scientific system. He viewed science as governed by systems of concepts or problematics that set questions, evidence, and importance. Althusser argued that structures which express ideologies are self-perpetuating. and not subject to changing historical forces, as Marx had claimed. Althusser killed his wife in 1980 and was committed to a psychiatric facility, thereby ending his academic career.
Why has Noam Chomsky's theory of language been so influential?
Chomsky's principle of a universal grammar is compatible with materialism. It entails that the mind can be scientifically studied like a natural phenomenon. Moreover, the output of speakers can be used as data from which to infer deeper linguistic structures than those evident in spoken language. Insofar as language is an important, if not primary, mental activity, the idea of innate physical structures determining language production has implications for understanding other mental functions. Chomsky's work in linguistics has had a strong influence on the philosopher of mind Jerry Fodor, 1935, for example.
What is Plato's simile of the cave?
Plato introduces the simile of the cave in the Republic to convey the power of the experience of forms and describe their importance. It is his metaphysics in a poetic nutshell. Imagine a cave where prisoners are chained to the wall and the only objects they can see are shadows of things carried behind a fire in back of them. If a prisoner is freed, he will first encounter the objects in the cave whose shadows he has seen before. If he ascends out of the cave, imagine his amazement when he sees these objects and the rest of the world, in full sunlight. Imagine also how his fellow prisoners might react if he attempts to relate what he has seen to them. The cave represents normal existence and perception, and the objects in sunlight are the world of the forms.
Who was Avicenna?
Avicenna, 980-1037, was a Persian physician and commentator on Aristotle. He was born near Bokhara, which was then the capital of the Samanid dynasty, located in present-day Uzbekistan. By the age of 10, he had mastery of the Quran and Arabic grammar and literature. By 16, he was highly knowledgeable about natural science, metaphysics, and theories of medicine. He also treated the sick and helped the Samanid prince Nut ibn Mansur, 976-997. His reward for that was access to the prince's library. Avicenna became an expert on the writings of Aristotle, wrote extensive commentaries, and also produced many treatises of his own on science, religion, and philosophy. His medical encyclopedia, Al-Shifa, The Healing, was based on Aristotle's work, and his Al-Qanun Fitab, The Canon of Medicine, written when he was 21, became famous throughout the Middle East and Europe. as an Aristotelian interpreter. He was well known for claiming that the universality of our ideas is a product of the mind. He was not a complete nominalist about universals, however, because he thought that there were differences and similarities among things of the same kind, which existed independently of thought. The products of thought were the formal qualities of things. This doctrine, known as intellectus informis agit universalitatem, neatly corresponded with Aristotle's claim that scientific knowledge consisted in truths about forms or essences. However, although Avicenna's interpretation of Aristotle seemed to be rather staid and unoriginal, his claim that it could be reconciled with Islam was soon challenged by Al-Ghazali, 1058–1111. And in the generation after that it was radically revised, along with Al-Ghazali's objections, by Averroes, c. 1126 c. 1198.
Who were the early 17th century freethinkers after Montaigne?
The freethinkers after Montaigne, 1533–1592, combined Pyrrhonic skepticism with anti-Aristotelianism against both religious orthodoxy and traditional authority. The most famous freethinkers, or libertines erudites, were Gabriel Naudé, 1600–1653, Guy Patin, 1601–1672. François de la Mothe l'Éveilleur, 1588–1672, Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, and Isaac La Peyrère, 1588–1672. Naudé and Patin were humanists with little interest in scientific claims. But La Mothe l'Éveilleur took up skepticism to undermine scientific knowledge. Out of this group, only Gassendi had a lasting influence on the course of both natural philosophy, what we would today call science, and philosophy proper.
What is continental philosophy?
Existentialism, phenomenology, critical theory, and structuralism all represent what is now called continental philosophy. Existentialism is a philosophical perspective on the world, which begins from the standpoint of one individual in ways that apply to all individuals. Phenomenology is a more abstract and systematic development of the processes of individual knowing and understanding. Existentialists have tended to be more literary than phenomenologists. Critical theory is a 20th century development of the theoretical methodology of Marxism. Structuralism is an application of a number of continental traditions to social criticism, resulting in analyses of social structures. One thing they all have in common is that their original foundational ideas came from European thinkers. But more than geography is at stake with this name. Continental philosophy is often contrasted with Anglo-American analytic philosophy, which has dominated in 20th century philosophy departments in American colleges and universities. since philosophy became a profession in higher education during the 1930s. It should be noted that what is true of American academic philosophy departments has not been true of English, French, and German departments in the United States, which over the 20th century welcomed continental philosophy into their curricula. Moreover, continental philosophy is not alone in its stepchild status among American professional philosophers. Because the same thing happened to American philosophy, also known as pragmatism, after the 1950s.
What was Ralph Waldo Emerson's infamous Divinity School address?
In 1838 Emerson was invited to give the graduation address at Harvard Divinity School. He said that while Jesus was a great man, he was not God. This enraged the Protestant community, who termed him an atheist and corrupter of young minds. He was not asked back to Harvard for 30 years. However, by the late 19th century, the doctrine that Jesus was not God was routinely accepted by Unitarians. Unitarians to this day reject the idea of the Trinity, which entails that Jesus was God. Although they recognize him as an extraordinary human being, perhaps even supernatural.
Did Auguste Comte believe in altruism?
Yes. In fact, Comte coined the word altruism, meaning an obligation to help and serve others, even at cost or harm to one's own self-interests.
How were Ludwig Feuerbach's ideas received?
After his early publication of work critical of Christianity, Feuerbach was dismissed from a teaching position at Erlangen University, where he had gotten his doctorate in philosophy. After that, he could not secure further academic employment. His ensuing criticism of Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831, did not help his situation.
How did Anaximander seek to revise Thales' philosophy?
Anaximander, c. 610–545 BCE, was interested in the idea of what was hot and dry. This was supposed by him to be opposed to Thales' idea of water, which was cold and wet. He reasoned that water could not be the primary substance out of which everything else was made, because the primary substance must be the cause of all the others. Since water is wet and often cold, it cannot be the source of anything that is hot and dry. Therefore, Anaximander reasoned, the primary substance must be something different from both water and things that are hot and dry. Anaximander called his primary substance which cannot be perceived. Only things that are cold and wet or hot and dry can be perceived. Apeiron, or that which is eternal and causes other things to change, but does not change itself. Apeiron, in other words, is that thing which can't be perceived itself but which is the origin of all things hot and cold, wet and dry. And for how these things change, it is responsible for everything in the world as we can and do perceive it. According to Anaximander, we see the sun, moon, and stars through holes in a cold, wet vapor that encloses earth. On earth, wet and dry have formed land and sea. And living things are the result of the sun's effect on moisture. All life started in the sea, according to Anaximander. A theory that actually anticipates the theory of evolution.
What is distinctive about the practice of analytic philosophy?
Analytic philosophy is as much a method as a set of traditional subjects. The method is a combination of empiricism and conceptual analysis, with as little speculation as possible.
How did race become important in feminist philosophy?
The complexity of feminist issues of race were underscored by University of California at Los Angeles law professor Kimberly Cruz's groundbreaking paper, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine. Feminist Theory and Anti-Racist Politics, University of Chicago Legal Forum 139-67, 1989. Kimberly's work introduced the problems of intersectionality, whereby oppressors due to race and gender can't simply be added because they result in distinctive new identities that form a situation of new forms of discrimination. Kimberly argued that black women are not protected by either discrimination laws for women or by discrimination laws for blacks. White women take precedence over them in the first instance and black men in the second. That is, anti-discrimination laws are satisfied in the letter of the law by protecting groups of women in which white women dominate, and groups of blacks in which men dominate. The result is that black women are not legally protected as black women.
What did Friedrich Nietzsche mean by the birth of tragedy?
Nietzsche was influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788–1860, who thought that the real world underlying everyday reality was composed of will, best perceived by us in music. According to Nietzsche, tragedy as an art form was an invention of the ancient Greeks, before Socrates. In order to cope with the chaotic and sorrowful nature of their lives, and indeed of life itself. The tragic play was a rational and beautiful dramatic structure, created by Apollo, the god of reason, which allowed the audience to participate in the underlying, Frenzied reality of disorder. This underlying disorder and merging of everything into an anguished but expressive drunken whole was what Nietzsche called the Dionysian element in Greek life. Thus, the Apollonian element of reason allowed the Dionysian element of disorder to emerge in the dramatic form of the tragedy. For the vicarious participation of the audience, who was represented by the chorus in the tragic play. In The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, which was his doctoral dissertation, Nietzsche quoted the great tragic playwright, Sophocles. There is an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, without capturing him. When Silenus at last fell into his hands, the king asked what was the best and most desirable of all things for man. Fixed and immovable, the demigod said not a word, till at last, urged by the king, he gave a shrill laugh and broke out into these words, "O, wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery! Why do you compel me to tell you what it would be most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon."
Why have existentialist philosophers claimed Dostoevsky as one of their own?
The great Russian novelist Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, 1821–1881, is considered an inspiration to the modern philosophical tradition of existentialism because of the depth of his appreciation for the difficulty of the human condition and the universal problems he and his fictional characters agonized over. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844–1900, said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom I have something to learn. He praised Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, 1864, for having cried truth from the blood. Indeed, in Notes from the Underground Dostoevsky introduces a self-deprecating narrator who became an iconic anti-hero for subsequent existentialist writers. The narrator's first words are, "I am a sick man," and his ensuing reflections, rantings, and ruminations make it clear that the sickness at issue is primarily a malaise of the soul. Not the least of the sickness is a disgust with reason. Although Dostoevsky is well known for valorizing simplicity in religious faith, he did not arrive at that viewpoint easily, either in works of fiction such as Crime and Punishment, 1866, or in his own life. In his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, 1881, Ivan is an atheist, while his brother, Alyosha, is studying to become a monk. In the famous Grand Inquisitor dialogue within this novel, Ivan presses Alyosha on his faith, going to the heart of the matter in asking how a good God can permit the suffering of innocent children. Ivan recounts the story of a peasant's child whom the Lord allows his dogs to tear apart, because the child threw a stone at one of them. The character of Alyosha is said to be modeled on Dostoevsky's close friend, the Russian philosopher Vladimir Sergeyevich Solovyov, 1853 to 1900, who longed to reunite the Roman Catholic and Russian Orthodox churches.
What do we know for sure about Plato's life?
Although Plato, 427 to 347 BCE, is perhaps the most influential and highly revered philosopher in the Western tradition, and thousands of philosophical careers have been based on his ideas, little is known about his life, with certainty. This is partly because there was a convention in Plato's time that philosophers writing about their contemporaries not mention them by name. Nevertheless, there is agreement on some broad facts about Plato's life. Plato, for instance, was present at Socrates' trial and began his own philosophical works about 15 or 20 years later. Plato was the scion of a politically well-placed, rich aristocratic family who were anti-democrats. At first, Plato envisioned a political career for himself. But after the Democrats gained power and Socrates was sentenced to death, he prudently avoided politics. Plato served in military campaigns in the war against Sparta and was probably in the cavalry. In the 380s BCE, he traveled to Egypt and Syracuse in Sicily. Plato went to Syracuse 3 times as guest of the tyrant Dionysius the Elder, and then of his son Dionysius the Younger. Both father and son were thought to be interested in Plato's ideas about government. But the results of Plato's involvement in Sicilian statecraft are usually referred to as disastrous. Plato never married, and when he died at the age of 81 he was relatively poor.
Who was Robert Boyle?
Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691, was the 14th child of the first Earl of Cork, who was the richest man in England. As the founder of modern chemistry, Boyle devoted his life to scientific investigation and methodology. He was well received at the British court, and a member of the Council of the Royal Society. Although he declined its presidency and the provostship of Eton because he did not want to take oaths. When he retired to a house in Pall Mall after a stroke at age 42, he maintained his own laboratory. Boyle's goal was to replace Aristotelian mechanics with explanations using just 2 things: matter and motion. He was also a champion of the new atomism, or corpuscular theory. Boyle's most famous works were New Experiments, physico-mechanical touching the spring of the air and its effects, The Skeptical Chemist, and The Experimental History of Colors. He also wrote a religious novel, Seraphic Love.
How well were Axum's ideas first received?
John Luttrell, former Chancellor of Oxford University, extracted over 50 heretical claims from Exum's writings and sent them to Pope John XXII, 1249–1334. Exum was summoned to a papal commission in Avignon, where French cardinals had moved the papacy from Rome. This relocation, which lasted from 1309 to 1377, was known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. 51 of Exum's offending theses were censured after 2 years. Although no charges were brought against him. However, while he was in Avignon, Exum conducted his own investigations of papal concessions to the Franciscans about collective poverty. He concluded that John XXII had contradicted these prior concessions in his own opposition to clerical poverty and that he was no true pope. When Exum heard that Pope John XXII intended to condemn his written judgment and defense of clerical poverty, he fled to the protection of the anti-papal regent in Bavaria. While he was there, the Pope excommunicated him in absentia. The Black Plague was at that time rampant in Bavaria and William of Exum is thought to have died of it.
Who was Ayn Rand?
Ayn Rand, 1905–1982, was a Russian-born American novelist who reacted strongly against communist and socialist political ideals, as well as Christian virtues of altruism. She is most famous for extolling the virtue of selfishness. In both her novels and her philosophy of objectivism. Her most popular novels are We the Living, 1936, The Fountainhead, 1943, and Atlas Shrugged, 1957.
Why did Vico oppose Cartesianism?
Vico concluded that René Descartes, 1596–1650, had been too enamored of mathematics and natural philosophy. Science, to the neglect or dismissal of art, law, and history as valid fields of knowledge. Vico also did not think that Descartes was right in seeking the same kind of certain knowledge in science that mathematics yielded. In his first book, On the Ancient Italian Knowledge, 1710, Vico argued that Descartes was wrong in holding awareness of his own existence as a first philosophical principle, and in trying to prove God's existence through reason alone. Vico's own view was that the mind does not make itself and for that reason cannot know how it has knowledge of itself. Concerning mathematical and even scientific certainty, Vico did not think we can arrive at it through clear and distinct ideas, as Descartes claimed. He claimed that mathematical knowledge is certainly true because the human mind has created the very standard for mathematical truth, or because we have made mathematics. However, God has made the physical universe, and only He can have certain knowledge about that. Vico did concede that when we do make things in nature, or through scientific experiment, we can gain knowledge from the confirmation of our hypotheses.
Did Hume believe that we have free will?
Yes, Hume believed in free will, but in a strange way. He argued that our freedom is based on the fact that we are determined by our existing character. If there were no causal link between our motives and our actions, then there would be no moral basis for praise and blame. That is, we do not praise or blame others for what they do accidentally or as flukes. For Hume, freedom therefore consists in the liberty to do what we want, or a lack of constraint. Our spontaneity is not the same as indifference, or the lack of a cause for doing one thing or the other. He wrote, by liberty, then, we can mean a power of acting or not acting, according to the determinations of the will. Now this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains.
Who were the main defenders of sense knowledge at the beginning of modern science?
Jean Bodin, 1530–1596, and Pierre Le Lawyer, 1559–1634, offered defenses of sense knowledge between 1581 and 1605. They held that even though sense knowledge is sometimes unreliable, its errors are corrected by further sensory experience. By the 1620s, two priests highly influential in both scientific and intellectual circles, Fathers Marin Mersenne, 1588–1658, and Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, used Pyrrhonic anti-Aristotelian arguments against Rosicrucianism and alchemy.
What is philosophy?
Philosophy is the activity of seeking wisdom. In Greek, which was the first language of Western philosophy, philosophy means love of wisdom. One loves wisdom by trying to figure out what it is. There are many ways human beings seek wisdom, including art, religion, and lived experience. Philosophy is distinct because it seeks wisdom through the systematic use of reason. Philosophers focus on ideas, the meaning of ideas, and beliefs by analyzing them. They break them down into their parts and then build them back up again and combine them in new ways. In addition to analysis, philosophers reflect on what goes on in the mind and the world. They seek wisdom through intuitions of whole structures of thought or experience.
What was the dispute between Leibniz and Newton about the calculus?
Gottfried Leibniz was very sociable intellectually, and welcomed a free and cooperative exchange of ideas. Toward the end of his life, though, he was greatly distressed by the claims of Isaac Newton's, 1643–1727. advocates that he had in effect plagiarized the discovery of the differential calculus from Newton. Leibniz reported that when he was in England in 1637 he was told about Newton's work on the calculus and wrote to him. Newton replied through an intermediary, although he wrote about the binomial theory, and included only the following sentence, in Latin, about the calculus, flux ions. The words of the sentence were presented by Newton, in code, as follows. It meant, given equation any whatsoever, flowing quantities involving flux ions to find, and vice versa. No one has ever been able to make sense of what Newton wrote Leibniz. Nor has anyone related it to the differential calculus. Although the string of letters are sometimes quoted to illustrate how unreasonable Newton was. Leibniz then invented a differential calculus on his own. Showed it to Newton's intermediary, and in 1684 published his method. By 1695, Newton's followers were accusing him of plagiarism. Over the centuries, scholars have exonerated Leibniz of plagiarism. The conclusion has been that they each independently invented the calculus and that Newton did so first, although Leibniz published first.
What was Ayn Rand's virtue of selfishness?
Rand believed that the highest human good was individual happiness, which is achieved through rationality. Every individual has an elevated duty to further his or her own self-interest. And others do not have a right to demand that one sacrifice oneself or one's interests simply because they are weaker or in need. In this sense, Rand was an ethical egoist.
What religious issues are involved in environmental thought, pro and con?
Some of the critical perspective derives from a Christian view embedded in Western political philosophy that God gave the earth and everything on it to humankind to rule over for our use. Only humans have the spark of divinity that justifies intrinsic value. Nonetheless, many religious groups have proclaimed an obligation of benevolent stewardship over parts of the earth.
What is Sufism?
Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. Its classical period, or Golden Age, was from 1000 to 1500. Sufism is believed to have branched out from Baghdad to spread through Persia, India, North Africa, and Spain. The movement supported lodges and hospices for students, Sufi adepts, and others visiting on retreat. Sufi practitioners were expected to go through different levels of spirituality. First were the stations, requiring acts of will and actions to suppress individual egos and attachment to and desire for worldly things. This would lead to God's grace. Once God's grace was granted, it could be experienced individually as love, mystical knowledge, or the loss of ego consciousness. Sufism began as a marginal practice but was accepted by Islamic leaders in the 11th century. Mainly through Al-Ghazali's, 1058 to 1111, efforts. Sufism then developed along distinct practical and intellectual directions. The practical paths required training in religious formulas and initiation into orders. It was accompanied by many fraternal and social organizations that continue in the present Islamic world. The intellectual path developed philosophical terminology and absorbed Neoplatonic influences. Culminating in Ibn Arabi's, d. 1240, system of theosophy. Within that system, God was held to be the only being. Everything else in existence was the result of his self-manifestation. The individual who could identify with all of God's self-manifestations would have the goal of becoming the perfect man, thus far attained only by the Prophet Muhammad. It is perhaps ironic that this intellectual path of Sufism developed when Al-Ghazali had embraced Sufism as part of a belief that knowledge and reasoning was not a reliable way to experience God.
How was Newton's system received?
Newton's, 1642 to 1727, laws were accepted with intellectual awe, bordering on reverence. Part of this reaction was gratitude for the comprehensive way in which he plausibly united both the atomic theory and the results of the Copernican revolution. Newton was famous for his claim of not going beyond the evidence. His motto was hypotheses non fingo, or I frame no hypotheses. However, this was not literally true, given his scholium that assumed absolute space and time, and his postulation of force as action at a distance. He also assumed that God existed. But Newton's stance of empiricism, he thought, for example, that with sufficiently powerful microscopes it would be possible to see atoms someday, carried the day on the issue of whether he really was an empiricist. Newton's work was almost immediately translated into European languages and became the new view of the universe. There were also popularized versions of his ideas, and by the early 18th century idealized portraits of him were in wide circulation. Francesco Algarotti published Newton for the Ladies in 1737, which was reprinted in many editions. Because girls did not receive the same education as boys, it was widely believed that scientific knowledge had to be simplified and expressed in more gentle language for women.